This is the Borders of Equality podcast, a podcast about immigration and political economy. In this episode, we feature a presentation by Katharina Natter, an assistant professor at Leiden University. Katharina studies immigration policies in authoritarian contexts. Intuitively, we could assume that democracies and autocracies have different ways to regulate immigration. For instance, democratic governments should support more open immigration policies. Autocrats, in contrast, should push for more closed immigration policies. This is maybe because some of the politicians we often perceive as authoritarians are also staunch opponents of immigration. Katharina shows that, in fact, democracies and autocracies actually have pretty similar immigration policies. It turns out that openness or closure, when it comes to immigration, doesn't vary so much by regime type, at least not systematically. This doesn't mean that the political process in both types of regime are similar. Katharina highlights what she calls the Illiberal Paradox, explaining the different constraints that both democratic and authoritarian regimes face when regulating immigration. In doing so, she links to other authors who show that democracies face a pressure for closure from citizens and argues that autocrats can be more flexible. Katharina can be found on Twitter at K_Natter or at her webpage at Leiden University. Her talk was recorded as part of the Leiden Interdisciplinary Migration Seminars organized by Iriel Glynn.
Iriel already said a little bit about it before, that I wrote my PhD at the University of Amsterdam over the past few years. And in that PhD, I focused on the dynamics of immigration policymaking in Morocco and Tunisia. So I did a comparative study looking at the drivers and dynamics of immigration politics in those two countries. And the idea for the paper that I'm going to present today emerged out of the Moroccan fieldwork that I did for the PhD, but it's a bit broader in its ambition. And the core question that it deals with is whether there is a systematic difference between immigration policies in democracies and autocracies, and if so, how this difference manifests. And of course, this is a very big question to which there is no straightforward answer. So what I hope to achieve with this paper is to sort of unbox some widespread assumptions about the link between immigration policy and political regimes, and then in a second step to introduce a concept that I hope could sort of structure this debate a little bit, and that's the Illiberal Paradox. So for those of you who are maybe not so familiar with this specific debate within migration studies, I should highlight from the start, I mean, it's not a surprise for any of you probably, but that the field is heavily biased by research on Western liberal democracies. Now, what do I mean by that? I really mean that almost all the theorizing that is done on immigration policymaking is based on research and made for research on liberal democracies in the West. And of course, I'm talking about immigration policies, so everything related to the entry and stay, as well as integration of migrants. I'm not talking about emigration or diaspora policies here, where the story is, of course, a bit different, right? But what is important to say is that a majority of this literature on immigration policymaking does claim that there is something distinctive about immigration policies in liberal democracies, that there is some sort of regime effect, so that the political regime in place would shape immigration policies and politics in a specific way. But the fact is that sort of what I've just said, the research on counterfactuals, so research that would examine immigration policymaking in non-Western democracies or in autocracies, is still largely missing. And when it exists, it is very case study based and very empirical. It's great research, but it's not very theoretical often. So the question then still remains, right? How can you know whether there is really a regime effect if you're only systematically looking at one side of the coin? And of course, I'm not the only one who has been asking this question. So there has been some group of researchers who have started to take on this question a bit more systematically, and there has been some really great research coming out more recently, looking at immigration policy dynamics in a various political systems. And so what I want to do in this paper is to sort of try and bring some of these insights together in a more systematic way, and sort of investigate this assumed regime effect, sort of trying to get a first answer to this question of how do political regimes impact immigration policy. Now, the starting point that I take in the paper is to look at existing data sets to get an idea of this link between political regimes and immigration policy. And I won't spend much time here, but I actually thought that the insights were so striking and so clear that it would be worth to at least share some snippets of it here. So what I did is first that I just simply merged the Polity4 database, which maybe most of you know, which is measuring political regime types, with the UN World Population Policies database, which is a database that provides insights into governments' self-declared policies on immigration since the mid-1970s. And so based on these declared goals of governments, immigration policy around the world is actually strikingly continuous. Like 2/3 of governments indicate that they would like to maintain the level of immigration. 1/4 aims at reducing immigration, and only around 8% of governments would like to increase immigration. But what's really interesting here, I found, was that when you disaggregate this according to regime type, the pattern actually doesn't change. So you see that the proportions are pretty stable, and increasing immigration is a rare policy objective regardless of the regime in place, and policy continuity seems to dominate as well across different regime types. But of course, declared migration policy preferences are maybe a bit of a vague measurement. So in a second step, what I did is that I merged the same Polity4 database with the DEMIC policy database. And this is a data set that looks at actually enacted migration policy changes. And I have compiled that data set when I was working at the International Migration Institute in a project of Hein de Haas. And so this data set records over 6,500 migration policy changes across 45 countries between 1900 and 2014. And again, when you look at all the changes together, you see that roughly half of them enact a liberal change, and roughly 1/3 a restrictive change. And then there are some reforms that don't really change the level of restrictiveness, but do other things. But again here, what struck me was that when you disaggregate this by regime type, the picture doesn't change. And I found this really striking because the sort of theoretical literature would really suggest that we would be finding some fundamental differences here across regime type. Now, this is, of course, a preliminary and maybe superficial insight, but it does seem to indicate that sort of the approaches towards immigration do not systematically vary depending on the regime in place. Of course, I'm not saying that there are no differences and that legal migration regimes don't vary, but at least the difference seems not related to the political regime in place. And so that was sort of the starting point of the paper. And the question that I want to focus on now is, okay, if political regime type doesn't really seem to matter for the substance of immigration policy, does that mean that immigration policies are sort of neutral to political regimes? And while my research and research of many other people suggests that that's not the case. And so what I try to do in the rest of the paper is that I argue that political regimes do shape immigration policy, but only with respect to sort of the policy-making processes that are at play, and with respect to the range of policy options that are available to decision makers, but not in terms of the actual substance or outcome in the end. And so to sort of make this argument, what I'm doing is that I introduce this concept of the illiberal paradox. But before introducing that, I think it makes sense to spend a few minutes on the liberal paradox concept that I sort of borrowed in the first place, and I'm not sure whether you're all familiar with it, so I just want to outline it here very quickly. So basically, the term was coined by James Holyfield in the early 90s to capture the contradictory drivers that liberal democracies are confronted to when they're elaborating their immigration policies. And so in a 2004 article, he sort of sums up his thoughts on this and writes, since the end of World War II, international economic forces have been pushing states towards greater openness, while the international state system and powerful domestic political forces push states towards greater closure. Hence, the liberal paradox, the economic logic of liberalism is one of openness, but the political and legal logic is one of closure. Now, so according to him, democracies are sort of subject to these two contradictory logics, right? On the one hand, you have sort of the dominant economic ideology of liberalism that pushes markets to globalize and pushes states to enshrine international human rights into national legislations. And this sort of provides the ground for open immigration reforms. And on the other hand, you have sort of the political logic of democratic nation states, which is dominated by, well, electoral objectives, but also by path-dependent bureaucratic decision-making, which then would drive immigration policies towards closure. And so this dynamic that he outlines has two consequences that are important here. The first one is that sort of fundamental policy reforms are much more difficult, of course, to enact than sort of incremental policy changes because of all the constraints that are involved. And secondly, sort of that there is a gap between discourses on immigration and the actual policies that are enacted, because the discourses target mainly the electorate and so are often more restrictive than the policies that are enacted and which have to take into account legal constraints and economic interests, et cetera, et cetera. And so in contrast to this dynamic that he highlights in democracies, I sort of suggest that autocracies are subject to an illiberal paradox. And so what I mean by that, or what I try to argue, is that autocratic regimes are bound by the same international forces of liberalism. So that's the same as before, right? Pushing for openness towards immigration, but that the domestic political logic is different, right? And so autocratic leaders are more autonomous from these political logics, asking for closure in democracies. And in particular, decision makers, of course, are a bit more independent from the potential anti-immigrant sentiment in the population. And also they are not bound by sort of the existing legal frameworks to the same extent as would be the case in consolidated democracies, just because the rule of law functions a bit differently. And this situation then allows autocratic leaders to more easily enact fundamental policy reform and to adapt the immigration policies to their own priorities, right? So in particular, this means that autocracies can paradoxically enact liberal immigration policies more easily than democracies if it fits sort of their economic priorities, their foreign policy goals, or sort of nation-state formation ideologies. So what I want to make sure here is that I'm not trying to say that autocracies are enacting more liberal immigration policies than democracies necessarily. We've seen before that that's not the case. But what I try to get at with this illiberal paradox is to suggest that autocracies can open their immigration policies more easily than democracies if they wish to do so. But of course, there are also some limitations to the open character of these policies in autocracies, right? And I want to quickly touch upon them because I think it's important to keep them in mind. So the first limitation really is that a discursive openness towards immigration in autocracies might not always be followed through in practice, right? So it seems that in autocracies, maybe immigration policy discourse might be often much more liberal, But then in practice, it might still be relatively restrictive. And so that's kind of the exact opposite of what Holyfield suggested for democracies and sort of the dynamics inherent to the liberal paradox. The second limitation really is that while, as I said, the autonomy of autocracies from legal constraints and democratic requests can favor liberal policies, right? But this autonomy also increases the vulnerability of these same liberal policies. So in particular, of course, you can think about liberal policies that are prone to sudden restrictive backlashes because of the limited role of judicial actors, and also because liberal policies are often not actually enshrined in law, but emerge out of executive decisions. And then the last limitation is that obviously immigration rights and integration rights don't automatically go hand in hand. So an open entry policy doesn't necessarily imply that these migrants are granted any socioeconomic rights. And so Martin Roos in his 2013 publication has conceptualized this dynamic in the number versus rights trade-off. And so what he's arguing is that countries are basically faced with a choice of either allowing a large number of immigrants and restricting their integration rights, or limiting immigrant numbers and sort of granting those migrants full integration rights. And so what this means in my case specifically is that sort of ironically, it might be easier for many people around the world to migrate to autocracies instead of democracies, with the obvious downside, of course, that little actual rights are attached to this migrant status in the first place. But despite these limitations, I do think that the illiberal paradox idea captures an important immigration policy dynamic in autocracies around the world. And so in the paper, what I'm trying to do is to develop a range of country cases that offer preliminary evidence for this illiberal paradox dynamic. But for the sake of brevity, I'm only really going to mention the case that I know best, of course, from my own research and that inspired my ideas in the first place, sort of to give you an idea of how this illiberal paradox feels like in practice, right? So just quickly on Morocco, in September 2013, the Moroccan king, Mohammed VI, quite unexpectedly announced a fundamental change in immigration policy. And this reform actually moved away from the very restrictive approach that had characterized immigration policy before, right? That was sort of, characterized by state violence towards irregular migrants, by unlawful expulsions and socioeconomic exclusion. And so the reform of 2013 launched a human rights-based policy that included 2 regularization campaigns of irregular migrants and the rolling out of quite an extensive set of integration programs. Now, as I show in another article, the main driver of this policy change was actually to consolidate the Moroccan monarchy by polishing its image at home and abroad, both in Africa, where Morocco has been really trying to consolidate its political and economic position, as well as in front of Europe, where, of course, Morocco has interests towards its diaspora, and where it wants to be seen as a progressive rights-respective state. And so the Moroccan case really exemplifies how sort of regime survival and geopolitical priorities can take precedent over domestic opinions or domestic political dynamics and lead to quite a fundamental liberal policy change on immigration. But of course, there are some caveats to it, right? So this opening towards immigration was first and foremost intended to be a tool of symbolic politics. And so what you see on the ground is that, yes, the situation of migrants in Morocco has really improved over the past years through the regularization and through sort of access to a minimal set of socioeconomic rights. But still, the implementation of the reform has been rather inconsistent, and many of the promises that have been made have not been realized yet. And so, and at the same time, there is always a risk of a sudden backlash that sort of always lingers a bit in the air. And so I think that the Moroccan case quite forcefully shows the potential, but also the limits of such an autocratic opening towards migrants. Now, I'm happy to develop some other examples afterwards, but time is running, so I would like to conclude on a few points here that sort of come out of the paper. So first of all, I think importantly, what the paper shows is that against widespread understandings and expectations of much of the literature, there seems to be no systematic difference in immigration policy substance across regime types. So in other words, democracies don't seem to enact overall more or less restrictive immigration policies compared to autocracies. But of course, that doesn't mean that immigration policies are neutral to political regimes. So what I try to argue in the second part of the paper is that political regimes do shape immigration policy dynamics, right? Particularly in terms of the range of policy options that are available and sort of the intricacies of the policy processes that are behind policy decisions. And so I'm introducing this illiberal paradox as sort of a conceptual tool to grasp some of the dynamics of immigration policy making in autocracies, in particular, the enactment of liberal immigration reforms. Like, how can we explain the enactment of liberal immigration reforms by autocratic leaders? And so I'm arguing that, well, actually autocratic regimes have more leeway to enact such liberal reforms if it suits the priorities of the regime in place, because they are more autonomous from electoral and bureaucratic dynamics that drive sort of restrictions in liberal democracies. And sorry, I forgot this point. And so there are a number of avenues for future research that I would like to explore, and ideas of where to take this paper further. And one of them is to sort of start and breaking open these notions of democracy and autocracy in the first place. And although I am using them in the paper, I actually find that these binary regime typologies are ultimately of limited analytical value to really get at immigration policy dynamics. So one way forward would be to sort of move towards a more practice-centered approach to political regimes that would allow to identify, for instance, autocratic practices within formal democracies and democratic practices within formal autocracies. And so ultimately, that's where my thinking is going. It might be that the illiberal paradox dynamic is actually not restricted to autocracies, but that it is in fact autocratic policy practices that would allow to enact liberal immigration policy more easily, whether it's in a democracy or in an autocracy. Yes, but this is really just an idea that is still not very ripe and that remains to be explored. So yeah, for now, I'm thanking you for your attention, and I look forward to your thoughts and comments and questions. Yeah, thank you.